Hey everyone, in this video, I will be revisiting a concept I tackled before Kingdom Hearts 3 released, which is a sequel to my video, What Mechanics Should Change. The idea of that video was to explain my concerns of KH3 making the same mistakes the handheld games did, such as Birth by Sleep and Dream Drop Distance. I will go over what mechanics I either still have an issue with, as well as say what KH3 did to improve from the handheld era. As of this video, we still don't have a real Kingdom Hearts 4 update since the initial trailer reveal, so keep that in mind at this point that I still have nothing solid to go on for mechanics. That said, let's get into it. I'm going to kick it off with listing what I believe doesn't need to be changed from KH3. It's easy to get lost in the issues you want to be fixed, but it's also important to acknowledge what was done well and should persist going forward. This will be mostly combat focused for the good, so let's start with Keyblade mechanics. KH3 introduced for the first time being able to equip up to 3 Keyblades, which also means you have 3 forms at any given time at your disposal. If you equate Keyblade forms to drive forms from KH2FM, you may be thinking this as a negative due to having only 3 forms over 2FM's 5 forms. However, I don't view it that way, simply because there is an extreme likelihood that players won't ever plan to utilize all 5 forms in even a small group of fights. For example, you'll likely be hard-pressed to find casual playthroughs of 2FM where you'll see players using Valor and Wisdom form over the others late game, especially on critical mode. So with that said, this change is fine to me. Since you can freely swap Keyblades between fights, you will overall have more forms anyway, so this allows for more player preference. What's even more interesting is that they made it so you can store the forms outside of fights for a while without the meter running out, as long as that Keyblade is not the current active one. Yet another smart mechanic to complement form usage. And of course, it's easier to build up a form in this than in 2FM as well. So going into KH4, if they choose to keep with forms like this, I don't see the issue. I also think 3 Keyblades is a good sweet spot to not be too minimal, but also not too overwhelming to sift through on the fly during a fight. KH3 also introduced Keyblade upgrades. This was a fun mechanic to work with because although I'm not a Kingdom Key fanatic, many are. This allows you to have an incentive to keep using that Keyblade. It's interesting when done like this because in the past, the most recent Keyblades you get tend to have better stats and better abilities attached to it, so you'd never want to go back to early game Keyblades unless you wanted an extra challenge, or perhaps equipping heroes' crests in KH2 that you get from Olympus's first visit should you only want to do air combos. But with this design, you can safely commit to an early game Keyblade if you just so happen to really like its form, rather than be baited into feeling like you need to use endgame Keyblades to do well. This is the same as other games that have weapon upgrades where you can choose to use early game or even starter weapons, such as in the Soulsborne series. For basic combat improvements, 0.2 and KH3 introduced being able to cancel your combos faster than in previous games. In KH1 and 2, going for a combo is very committal. If an enemy isn't staggered and ready to attack mid-combo, you're likely to get slammed. KH2 can sorta get around this with Panic Reflex mid-combo, but it doesn't put you in an advantageous position often because you're at the mercy of whether or not an attack will be on you still after the Reflect cooldown. In modern action games, fights tend to be faster paced than they used to be, so many allow faster combo canceling to get out of rough situations. This helps in a couple different ways. For one, it helps on enemies and bosses that may not stagger normally. For example, large enemies in KH tend to not stagger most of the time. Due to their design of being able to toss a move out whenever they feel like it, this complements that well so you're not just sitting there doing nothing waiting for an attack just to be safe, or only doing partial combos as well. Of course, this would be broken if every attack thrown out is a stagger, but because it often is not, this makes it well balanced, and I welcome it. KH3's DLC fixed it further so that some of the combo modifiers, such as Triple Rush, could be cancelled faster as well. They also gave you good defensive options that can be cancelled into. For example, being in the air in data fights is a decently large liability, which can become quite dangerous due to the floaty aspect of aerial combat in KH3, but at the very least, they still give you good defensive options in the air, such as an air slide into an immediate guard, which can be done mid-combo with cancelling. On the ground, you can also quickly dodge roll into guard as well. This is a solid change from KH1 and 2 that once again complements the design philosophy of enemies and bosses that KH3 has. As for boss design, for the most part, it was also an improvement over Asaka Team's previous designs. A majority of attacks from the world bosses are telegraphed or reactable, with only a small amount of situations that are annoying, such as Skull's desperation move having those dropping projectiles that can randomly hit you, or Mother Gothel spawning flowers too much where you may want to camp against them. It can be, of course, quite a challenge with boss design, because you don't want every attack to be an obvious slow swiping animation, but you also can't just have them do frame 1 attacks if you want it to be done fairly. So at the very least, I approve of the improvements, and just like with mob fights, hope that improvements keep happening. If the data fights in Yozora in Cage 3 DLC is any indication, it seems they may have been getting this down finally. Last positive combat-specific mechanic I'd like to mention is revenge value and stagger endurance. A huge fear of mine before Cage 3 released was that Osaka Team would implement the same bad revenge value mechanics that BBS and DDD had, which is essentially not really having the mechanic at all. Cage 2 FM was done overall just fine with having it so when you attack bosses when they're open, you're allowed to hit them a certain amount of times depending on the type of attack until they retaliate. Of course, this allowed for some exploits here and there, but the system as a whole was quite solid. BBS and DDD threw that away and essentially made it very uncommon that bosses would even stagger, or if they did, it would be for 1 or 2 hits. A huge offender, Vanitas, was a repeat boss that could break out of every single hit you throw at him when he's open, which is about as bad as it gets. Fortunately, Cage 3 did implement proper revenge value on the humanoid bosses, so we ended up having a solid system again. What was even more interesting was they implemented a system we call Stagger Endurance, which is reserved for larger enemies that normally wouldn't stagger in older Cage games. Although I do wish that they had a meter to represent it, or even revenge value for that matter, it did mean that you get rewarded for continually hitting large bosses when they're open. The only slight downside on top of no meter is that base Sora attacks do almost nothing to the endurance value, so that's why when you use forms a lot you see some of these large bosses hard stagger more often. But other than that, both RV and Stagger Endurance were pretty well done in Cage 3 and a good pivot from the handheld's atrocious designs. 100% this should persist in future Cage games again. Moving on from combat on positive mechanical changes, I just want to talk a bit about the movement. I still believe that air step is a great tool that helps you get around quickly in these large areas and catch up to enemies. KHDDD realized with larger areas they would need good movement to avoid it being a slog to move through and explore, so they created flow motion to get around. Cage 3 came up with air step to go along with flow motion. Outside of combat, it's used to zip across quickly to predetermined locations which would otherwise be rough to get through. And in combat, it closes the gap so in large area battles you aren't stuck slowly gliding or air sliding to the enemy. I do hope they continue to carry on some form of quick movement around. It would be a mistake to tone it down in my opinion. Next, let's talk about the food mechanic, which was newly introduced in Cage 3. Like many other RPGs out there, using this gives you a temporary boost to certain stats depending on what you make. Failing to utilize this mechanic will cause many players to struggle on critical mode, while on lower difficulty, it can be overkill. I'm not sure I would say this mechanic needs to continue on, but I wouldn't be upset if it did. Granted, the only real issue I have with it is that when I use it, I feel forced to rush during fights to fully take advantage of it. I'm sure that sounds insane since I'm also a speedrunner of Cage, but remember that casual play, speedrunning, and challenge playthroughs are all different types of experiences. As far as critical mode goes, using food doesn't break the game by any means and can even help with low damage output issues on level 1. Furthermore, if you don't want to do minigames for food, you have buyable meals that are easy to afford. Lastly, for positive mechanic changes, we have Gummi missions. The franchise has had many types of between-world transportation sequences across the games. Cage 1, 2, and 3 all have Gummi missions, while DDD had dives. And as it turns out, I think Cage 3 improved the mainline Gummis a lot. Why is that? Because you no longer have to spend nearly as much time in them. Cage 2 forces you to do all 9 routes once if you want to get to each world, and every route is around 3 to 5 minutes of a nearly mindless auto-scroller. It's quite a slog to do more than once. Cage 1 is also pretty rough with this, but the routes are overall much shorter in time since you can speed them up. In Cage 3, you can quickly fly from point A to point B, where there's only a few forced bosses along the way. So if you're someone like me that has zero fun doing Gummi missions, this is a blessing. I'd be fine with them dropping in between travel to worlds in Cage 4, but if it's minimal like Cage 3's, it'll be fine. Anyway, that wraps up the positive mechanic changes, most of which I'd say should persist in this series, and some of which I feel is essential as well. Now, it's time to tackle what mechanics should change. I definitely want to start off with one of the most important mechanics a game can have, which is game balance. This, of course, is still something that to this day is a problem in many games. For this specific type of game balance, I'm not referring to situations of a game getting a large difficulty spike out of nowhere, or the like. Instead, I'm speaking about the player's ability to use the game's mechanics to essentially plow through mindlessly. At its core, Kingdom Hearts has always been a hack and slash. On easier difficulties, you can mostly mash your way through these games without any repercussions. But when you jump into higher difficulties, that's where these games tend to shine in mechanics, where you're forced to understand dodging correctly and when enemies and bosses are safe to attack. This is when you aren't allowed to really mash your way through fights as reliably. The game balance overall should be at the very least decent to complement the game's mechanics. If not, you get situations such as BBS where you can easily spam a select 1 to 3 commands for offense and spam 1 command for defense. Or in DDD, where you are self-imposing restrictions to not just spam Balloonra the entire time, as the move shreds all enemies and bosses with ease. Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 are still great at complementing its mechanics on higher difficulties, where only really in end and post game do you have incredibly strong spammable moves, but then we get to Kingdom Hearts 3. And as we've learned, Osaka Team still struggles from a game balance perspective. It's not necessarily as bad as BBS and DDD in the balance department, but it's still pretty egregious. Now of course, bringing up game balance might make some players question why it should even matter to have proper balance in a single player game. There are definitely people who will not care that you can spam one move to clear an entire game, and there's probably nothing I can say to convince them otherwise if they don't inherently understand why it's bad. But I will reiterate regardless that there's little point in engaging with the game's mechanics if the game itself doesn't need you to. Kingdom Hearts has beginner difficulty for the people who want to mindlessly plow through a game. Standard mode exists for those who want a relatively normal playthrough but probably don't want to die in fights. Then you get to proud and critical modes, where the game is supposed to be decently challenging. There's far less of a point in doing these difficulties if you can clear up by spamming a small handful of things that's gotten fairly early in the playthrough. Essentially, KH3 is a mess when it comes to balance. I'm not here to pretend KH1 and 2 didn't have balance problems as well, but KH3 is a whole other level of wackiness. The way KH3 is set up is that there is a small handful of absolutely busted spammable methods of plowing through mobs or a boss that you are majorly self-imposing restrictions to not abuse. Of course, it's a bit nuanced if you're playing proud or critical. For some reason, the devs decided the answer to spamming magic on crit was to greatly nerf your max MP so that you run out extremely fast without items. While on proud, you have access to a massive MP bar that allows much more magic usage, so keep that in mind as I explain further. So going back to what's broken in KH3, here's a general list of the biggest offenders. Fire spam, links, Ever After shotlock, attractions, Olympus Coliseum Keyblade's counter, random strong limits, and random grand magic. We'll ignore Ultima form for now, since that's very late game and optional to obtain. The issue with the listed broken spammable moves is that if you don't use any of them, the game can become quite miserable real quickly. This tends to coincide with another major issue, which is damage calculations alongside enemy HP. KH1 and 2 were simple with enemy HP bars. In KH1, no boss could have more than 6 HP bars, and in KH2, all story bosses did not exceed 7 bars of HP. Then, you take a look at KH3, where Toy Box's early game boss already has 7 bars of HP. Then, you get past the halfway point, and Arendelle's boss has 15 bars of HP. That's almost as much as a data fight in KH2. So, what's going on here? I've had a theory since game release that still feels correct, which is that they heavily inflated boss HP to counteract the insane amount of damage you can easily do across all difficulties with broken moves. The damage formula doesn't seem to work well with the high DPS you can dish out. In KH1, it's hard to dish out strong DPS. In KH2, it's somewhat hard to do it until end and post game. In KH3, you have a handful of ways to dish out bars of damage very early. This all comes down to bad damage calculations. One shotlock from Ever After Keyblade should not delete multiple HP bars from story bosses, nor should one spam round of fires. Ralph should not be able to one-shot a world boss and delete most of the HP of other bosses in one go. As I've said, KH2 isn't really fully exempt from doing crazy damage in the post-game. Final Form Faraga, Reflega spam, Duck Flare, Magnega into Thundaga, etc. These can all shred super bosses in mob fights, though it's probably worth noting the nuance of this, which is that if you're not stat boosting, base level 99 setups on critical mode don't just delete entire data org HP bars instantly and require still having to figure out the fights. For example, you can't even use Final Form if your party members are dead, which is something that happens quite easily on super bosses. Reflect spam is nice, though you also need to be next to the boss to deal the splash damage, and there are cooldowns in between that can make it risky to blindly spam on higher difficulties. But I may be getting off track here, because when I'm criticizing KH3's balance, I'm talking about the main game mostly. The bottom line here is that KH3 tries to account for a casual first-time player just waltzing into a boss and tossing out ever after shotlock twice and trying to make sure that it doesn't just end the fight instantly. Same with using your entire MP bar to spam fire. What really is rough here is that the bad balancing and damage calculations have a huge side effect of negating a lot of the use of forms. For post-game, sure, AoE fire spam in a form is incredibly busted, but for the main game, you don't get as much mileage as using your other options. Are you in a mob fight? Well, just use Simba, guaranteed huge damage that one-shots most enemies. How about a boss? Use ever after shotlock twice at the beginning. More if you pop an elixir or refocuser item, then the boss is likely dead. If you don't want to waste an item, then you'd do 2 ever after shotlocks into fire spam. Pretty much using any other utility, such as form combos, is a self-handicap. Links are busted, fire spam is busted, and ever after shotlock is busted. What is not busted? Form combos, which is supposed to be an integral part of how you play KH games. Now, credit where credit is due, forms all have the hidden potential ability, which helps scale you up a bit if you're underleveled. This can help, but doesn't always. It does make it more useful to use form combos than base Sora combos though. But also, just kidding, because the DLC All Pro Codes options expose the scaling issues by not allowing you to use forms anyway, as well as any of the other broken abilities, so bosses are a tedious slog with Pro Codes enabled. Unfortunately, as we've seen from Osaka Team's combat design from the handhelds, they're not big on combos being utilized, but rather just have big button DPSs be the way to go. You can watch all the cool social media combo clips you want, but they're not going to be as effective as just spamming the broken damage methods. Also, don't forget that on top of the already broken methods of dealing massive damage instantly, there's still the random situation command pop-ups that deal absurd damage for you as well, such as the Zaz and attraction flows, unless you turn that off on critical mode. Anyway, I can sit here and ramble about the bad balance all day, but the point of this video is to also offer solutions. So how do you fix the balancing and bad damage calculations? Well, for starters, damage formulas should have a proper damage ceiling and floor. A simple way to not need a story boss to have 17 bars of HP is to just ensure no incoming damage hits exceed a certain amount, so a damage ceiling or cap. Maybe you still want ever after shotlock to be good. That's fine, but maybe don't have 2 uses of it take off 7 out of 10 bars of HP. Maybe you still want unloading an entire MP bar with fires to do worthwhile damage. That's fine as well. Don't let each fire take off over 1/4 an HP bar. Implement diminishing returns possibly, or sort of a stale move mechanic like Smash can have of repeating the same move in a row too quickly. In hindsight, having a low MP cost quickly spammable homing nuke probably wasn't the most brilliant design. Although it's funny, KH1 can sort of do this, but it's pretty niche when it's useful, and the fire's still pale in comparison to KH3's. Not to mention the obvious design in KH1, where you can't move while doing it to get away safely while spamming, and it not going as far. Man, KH1 kinda did a good job there, huh? For links, you of course still want them to be useful, but I'd prefer if they went back to KH2's design of them being passive helpers, rather than taking over your character. Even KH1 did this with some summons, like Bambi. But if the devs insist on them being giant nukers, maybe make them a little more interactive and less possible DPS. Summoning Simba into mashing attack and then pressing triangle to dismiss him into his nuke is rather bland, despite being a good help in mobs regardless. Meow Wow, Ariel, and Stitch all have the same problem too. Only Ralph is pretty involved, but also incredibly broken if utilized correctly. But unlike the others, he's much harder to use properly on a first playthrough. And for the other end of the damage calculations, we want a proper damage floor. KH3 is a little mixed on this. KH3's base damage doesn't have generous damage calculations if you like to do hard challenge playthroughs. If you decide to do a minimalist playthrough of level 1, no Keyblade upgrades, no food, no stat boost, then prepare for mind-numbingly awful boss and mob fights. KH1 had this issue too, though it was the first in the series, so I have a hard time blasting them for it from back in 2002. EXP0 that was added into PS3's 1.5 version helped with this if you were doing a low level or level 1 playthrough, but all the way in KH3 it seems odd to make that same mistake when KH2 appeared to have done it fine. In KH2, you could stick with Kingdom Key, be level 1, not use stat boosts or even armor and accessories, and still do fair damage and in post-game. That's because that game's damage calculation allowed for a damage floor to give you decent minimal damage if your stats aren't high enough to beat the floor. This meant that after the first few opening worlds, the floor scaling took over and allowed you to at least deal manageable damage. Of course, non-super bosses having mostly 5 to 7 bars of HP helps a lot here too. KH3 was missing this, so if you were doing a level 1 playthrough, you would definitely want to be Keyblade upgrading and using food often, arguably using stat boost too, to avoid the bad damage floor scaling. As I've said in my reviews of KH3, it makes total sense to do lower damage when you're doing a challenge playthrough, but there should be a base amount of damage that is at least bearable, and then you can scale from there based on levels, upgrades, stat boosts, etc. A solid example of how insufferable this can feel like is if you play Dark Souls 1 at level 1 and try to use a physical weapon without upgrading it. Because that game doesn't do damage floor scaling, you do chip damage to every boss outside of the first few. I will also quickly bring back up the Ultima Weapon Keyblade for this balance discussion. Like usual with KH, this is a Keyblade that is obtainable endgame and optionally. In KH3, it's immensely strong. Its shot lock is an AoE mob one-shotter. This means if you try to do New Game Plus and carry this Keyblade over, there's little reason to do anything other than shot lock with it. For bosses, its form combos are boss destroyers as well. I don't want to spend more time on specifically this Keyblade, but I'd say in KH4, let's perhaps not have a Keyblade that towers this much over the others. Because if the goal is to let players choose which Keyblade form combos they prefer, it's hard to ignore massive easy damage like this, same as all the other available broken methods of damage. So let's wrap up this game balance critique that also led into damage calculation issues. The goal overall that I would love to see KH4 accomplish is the following to fix KH3's missteps. Correctly balance combat options so that players don't have to self-impose restrictions to avoid doing 5 bars of HP in one move. Correctly set up a damage formula that can take into account being highly under and over leveled so you don't have to inflate boss HP bars to insane heights. Less random appearing moves, if any at all, so that you aren't randomly awarded 1+ bars of HP damage for little to no reason. Again, not everybody is on board with game balance in single player games. There will be plenty of players who want to spam a simple broken move in every fight to delete half of a boss's HP amount. But I don't believe that's healthy for game design to do. I can't sit here and say KH3's battles are a challenge unless you don't use 7 different easily accessible options. Also, just to make sure I wasn't misremembering the way Proud Mode worked, not only did I do a quickish playthrough of Critical Mode before this video, I also did a Proud Mode run-through as well again. Your crazy DPS options change depending on what difficulty of these two you choose, but some are still crazy good always, such as Simba. Lastly, for balance, as a small insert, I do want to speak about mob fights. The way mob fights have evolved over the years in the series has been concerning. Up until 0.2, most mobs only really had a handful of enemies at most to deal with, outside of uncommon scenarios or gimmick fights. KH3, though, tends to put many enemies at once in these mob fights, and also gives too many of these enemies the ability to projectile across the arena, whether it's a projectile or their body itself. This makes mob fights a nightmare to deal with on higher difficulties for the wrong reasons, because it means if you're not spamming a strong crowd control option, such as links or attractions, then you often have a chance of being interrupted mid-combo on whatever group of enemies you're attacking. Of course, the obvious rebuttal to this would be, well, why don't you just use the numerous crowd control options? And to that, I say, what about pro codes? When the DLC released, a patch put in easy and pro codes to give you even more ways to play. Pro Codes has trophies attached to it that require you to beat a certain amount of bosses with Pro Codes enabled. While you don't ever have to turn it on for mob fights to get those trophies, some may try this challenge, much like how you can do in Cage 2. Some people will do things like Kingdom Key, no summons, drives, etc. The fights in Cage 3 are much more challenging to do like this, because not only will you do minimal damage, but you'll just end up getting sniped by enemies barreling themselves at you across the field or shooting a quick projectile from behind. Going forward, it might be wise to either cut down on the amount of enemies at once in mob fights, perhaps lower the amount of projectile spammers in fights, or even design a method of being able to react and handle off-screen projectiles with Sora that doesn't require crowd control. Of course, you still should be well rewarded for using crowd control, but it would be nice if challenge playthroughs were also not as miserable as possible just because they went a little too crazy with mob design. I would also take it a step further to suggest that they don't give so many enemies super armor. There's no reason Dusks should be able to use these quick super armor attacks that nearly one-shot you on critical mode. They really don't need it. These types of super armor usages should be more limited. Finally, let's move on from balance and briefly discuss combat flow. A large disappointing mechanic for me in Cage 3 was that using a summon requires you to have full MP and also consumes the whole bar. This greatly hinders combat flow and creativity. Cage 1 is of course a little primitive here, so we'll use Cage 2 as a comparison. In Cage 2, you can open a fight with using magic, and then before your MP bar runs out, choose to go into a limit, and then even after that, you could do a summon or a drive as a follow-up. In Cage 3, when it comes to magic and summons, you get one or the other. You either decide to do fun damage mixing in magic with combos, or you just use a summon instead. Going forward, on top of fixing the balancing of your options, you should be allowed to have more interesting combat flow. Next, let's talk about a fairly common critique of combat, which is that Cage 3 is too floaty. I've noticed when others bring up this issue, it's not usually clear whether or not they actually understand what the problem is, so let me detail it more. Because in a way, Cage 2 can have floatiness too when in the air, so it's more nuanced than that. Firstly, as far as my personal thoughts on it is, early on I was incredibly concerned at the airtime you have in Cage 3 during nearly every moment the game throws you in the air. As hopefully many have figured out, back in the Cage 3 handheld era, Osaka Team's clunky aerial combos were absurdly awful and demotivated players from wanting to ever do them. You would be wide open doing these slow clunky aerials. 0.2 was also quite rough in the air with Aqua, though at least in that you could do aerial barrier guarding, which helped a little, but seeing Cage 3 promote being stuck in the air forever was quite concerning. The good news is that as of right now, the floatiness of Cage 3 is not nearly as bad as the handhelds, and in some ways it can actually benefit you. For example, a fair amount of enemies in the base game can't hit you in the air. They also made it so that you have at least reasonable aerial defense options, such as air sliding into a guard coming out extremely fast to avoid some attacks. Not just that, but the DLC combo modifier abilities make it feel less floaty and clunky too. Here's an example of pre-DLC aerial combos before you get combo modifiers learned on base Sora. Yeah, it's a little rough. At this point in time after the DLC fixed some of the problems with this, I think it would probably be nice to have a way to snap down to the ground faster. Cage 1 and Cage 2 can both do this with base aerial finishers, but Cage 3 lacks this. You can get to the ground with air step if a target is also on the ground, but that won't always be the case of course. Also, being in the air is still a bit of a liability in the DLC super bosses. If you air slide dodge a move in Cage 3, your only option to keep defenses up is to do a double flight if you didn't use it yet, or guard. Otherwise, you're wide open and have hang time before you start to slowly fall. It's not like on the ground where you can dodge roll and then stall more without being in danger. That's where the persisting floatiness can still be an issue. Like I said though, at this point in time, it's at least significantly more functional to be in the air in Cage 3 than on the handheld games, and I somehow doubt the devs will go back to the way Cage 1 and 2 handles aerial combat. I think maybe it could be cool to have perhaps a dodge move that shoots you down to the ground, not like the slow combo mods that do that, but an instant one. Sort of like an air slide, but to the ground. That could possibly instantly fix floaty issues and honestly sounds cool and fun. And of course with Cage 4, we need more fluid combo mod moves for base Sora if they really want us to combo in the air this much. I think fixing these two things alone could do wonders to quell floaty aerial combat complaints, so here's to hoping for that. Before I wrap up this floaty segment, the clip you're seeing now in the background is a demonstration of dodging Xehanort Data's desperation move while being fully airborne. This is a good example of how you still can be quite defensive in the air. It's only not often preferred because it generally requires you to fully know how to dodge a combo attack like this, because as I've said, you have hang time cooldown in between options if you don't chain them together quickly. I just wanted to toss this bit in as proof of concept that you can indeed dodge most things in the air if you're aware of their pattern already. Moving on, let's talk about other types of combat mechanics I believe should change. First, which should hopefully be an easy fix, is to adjust Keyblade switching mid-combo to actually work. Assuming Cage 4 continues allowing multiple Keyblades with Keyblade switching, this is something that desperately needs to work correctly. The amount of times I press the Keyblade switch action mid-combo only to have it either not read it or come out too slow ruins many combos, allowing enemies to even recover sometimes. If the Keyblade switch can't happen immediately after you press the button, it should queue it up if it's within a reasonable amount of time frame. As of right now, it's rather risky to try a Keyblade switch mid-combo. There is a workaround exploit with popping an item that can be cancelled into a Keyblade switch that always works, but there's no reason it shouldn't just work normally. I just recently played through Devil May Cry 3 for the first time, and as old of a game as that is, it does weapon swapping just fine instantly, so there's no reason Cage can't figure that out and make it work well. On the subject of smaller combat issues, I want to quickly mention that it's fairly cool that Cage 3 gave you different counter abilities, since Cage 2 only really had counter guard. But Cage 3 even went further with allowing abilities like wrist dodge to counter attacks that break your guard. However, what I'm not a fan of is counter kick. The only disadvantages to that move is that it comes out slightly slow and only goes in one direction, but it is wildly easy to land still and it's a lingering hitbox. This, to me, dampens the reward of learning how to time your punishes on bosses when you can just toss a counter kick out and it'll almost always do it for you so long as your guard connects. And remember, guard in Cage is not like parry in other action games. You have a fairly generous window for a guard to connect, so that leading into an auto punish is less rewarding than previous Cage games. So I'd prefer if they move away from that design. The other two counter abilities and also wrist dodge are fine. Technically, you can use arrow to get a similar effect, but it doesn't work off of a guard the same way. Another tiny issue that still irks me is if they continue to keep the situation command gauge, it needs to be tightened up a bit. Firstly, I would prefer a bar personally. If it's still arrows, fine, no huge deal, but the real problem is that using a situation command kills the buildup. So if you have 2 out of 3 arrows filled, but a situation command like Faraza is about to expire, using that depletes your built-up bars. I see no reason it should do that, nor can I think of a way this is abusable. Simply have it not deplete the built-up bars. Currently, it also depletes over time of not hitting enemies for long enough. That probably is fine, but definitely stop having it being fully depleted by using a command. I'm unsure if that's intentional or a bug at this point. Next, there's the horrendous mechanic of wall knockback. In Cage 2, you don't bounce off the wall, you just fall with it. In Cage 3 and some of Osaka's other Cage games, you bounce off of it, which also cancels your second chance in once more and puts you in a longer recovery animation. The bosses, though, for some reason, they recover faster. Hitting bosses into the wall allows them to avoid your slower combo moves and also retaliate on you if they manage to recover, mostly specific to enemies that float. It makes zero sense to have it set up this way. If you wall splat a boss, that should give you more of an opening, not less. Hopefully, they for sure change this in Cage 4. So that covers the combat-specific mechanical changes I'm hoping for. We're going to jump into difficulty next and other partial inside and outside combat critiques for the rest of the video. As I just mentioned, let's jump into a discussion on Cage difficulty selection. Cage's hardest difficulty since 2FM has been critical mode. Cage 3 intended to have critical mode, but it wasn't given on release, we had to wait for a patch. This meant all players had to go to proud mode on first playthroughs that wanted a challenge on game release. The problem here was of course that proud mode is incredibly easy for seasoned Cage players, and likely normal action RPG players as well. On my first playthrough, the only non-minigame death I had was to triple Nort, unless you count Final Xehanort's anti-form sequence as not a gimmicky minigame, then that too. Other than that, it's quite hard to die on proud mode if you know how to play Kingdom Hearts. And I was underleveled as well, since I wanted to finish the game in one stream, which took 24 hours to do, so I was rushing it faster than most. To make matters worse, it wasn't until the DLC that we had challenging super bosses, so this caused Cage 3 to be perceived as being a joke at difficulty, of course exasperated by the nuke spam you can do. Then, critical mode finally gets added in, and players get humbled real quick. Similar to 0.2, you have much less HP and MP than in Proud, leaving you to get one or two-shotted by strong attacks easily. I saw plenty of people complain about the challenges of critical mode because Proud mode does not really require you to engage with mechanics, but on crit, if you're not using food or Keyblade upgrades for example, it becomes a severe challenge. For me personally, crit is still a decent challenge. Even replaying it with broken strats, I still end up dying sometimes. It doesn't always feel fair, but a lot of the time it does. As of right now, crit is currently available on a first playthrough since it was added in. I've done a lot of reflecting on this, and I've come to the conclusion that critical mode as is should be how Cage 4 does its hardest difficulty. The difference is, Cage 4 must do it on release, or it'll be the same mess again. I don't believe Cage 3's critical mode is too hard for a first playthrough, nor too easy. Of course, it's not too challenging if you use the handful of broken methods of damage dealing, but that's the game design's fault more than critical mode itself. And if you want to take it a step further, you can do level 1 critical mode if just base critical mode wasn't enough for you. Critical mode should be a challenge, and it still manages to be exactly that. You are expected to die a decent amount. I think due to sloppy mob design and some boss moves, you may die a bit more unfairly than you do in Cage 2 FM's critical mode, but it's still a solid contender. And for the record, Cage 2's Proud mode was also considered easy. Many people I've seen criticize Cage 3's Proud mode being easy may have forgotten that Cage 2's Proud mode is also a joke, but the difference is that Cage 2 FM added in critical mode, which is now the standard for the hardest way to play Cage games. So releasing a new Cage without that is a huge blow to the perceived difficulty hard mode has been known for in Cage. FF16 made this same mistake. The game didn't offer a proper hard mode for fluent action RPG players, so the game was perceived as easy because the only way to have a challenge is to New Game Plus into Final Fantasy mode and reach the DLC there or do the optional Kairos Gate dungeon. Even the game's Final Fantasy mode on New Game Plus wasn't really that rough because you're already familiar with the game by then. Square Enix needs to be a little less afraid of a proper hard mode first playthrough on release. In Cage 3's instance, you can do a second playthrough of crit at level 1 if you thought crit still didn't challenge you enough, but at least critical mode is still a challenge. All I want for Cage 4 is to allow a hard first playthrough, where a blind play in critical mode is still hard, but not level 1 hard, while also not being as easy as Proud mode is. While we're on the subject of difficulty, I may as well mention New Game Plus. This is a feature that is becoming increasingly more common in modern RPGs. Some people are one-and-doners, but some others may be interested in what a New Game Plus has to offer for replayability. In many older games, you just had to start a fresh file, but sometimes people like playing through again with all the effort of their items, build, levels, etc. intact. Suffice to say, Cage 3 fails New Game Plus. To be fair, it's far from the only game that does this. Xenoblade 1 does this as well. New Game Plus just lets you carry over literally nearly everything except certain key items, and then you just get to replay the game again, but being even stronger, which of course is likely not as enticing for players. Soulsborne games, for example, get harder on New Game Plus. Most of them stop scaling at New Game Plus 7, but you cleverly get to continue on re-experiencing the same boss fights on New Game Plus without just mowing them down, because they get stronger each time as you do. Tales of the Abyss also had a clever New Game Plus. Depending on how well you played first time through, you get points to distribute into what you want to carry over into New Game Plus. You can even use those points to activate EXP multipliers and such. But for Cage 3, the only benefit would be if you did a beginner, standard, or proud mode playthrough and wanted to start a critical mode playthrough with your earned abilities. Granted, this would make it far less challenging, but some may have been okay with this. But if you played critical mode first, it's essentially worthless then. My overall point here is that New Game Plus shouldn't feel worthless. I want to see New Game Plus be more like what Soulsborne does, or Tales of the Abyss did. I'd prefer this over just a New Game Plus that is the same experience again, but you're 10 times stronger for a majority or all of it. Let's move on to non-combat mechanic critiques. First up would be requesting they fix auto movement. KH never used to do this, but KH3 is littered with auto hops, jumps, and slides that can get in the way of intentional movement. I'd personally love being able to turn that off in options. I pointed this out in a previous review, but once again, no, I don't need to auto hop over a railing that I can just press the jump button to clear. Not to mention, any fight that has auto movement can take over your intended option and just leave you wide open to attacks since you're not iframed during them. Moving on, let's talk Glide. This ability has been a staple since KH1, so there's no reason for them to stop giving you this ability. However, they do need to make sure two important situations are accounted for. First, they need to ensure that if you get it as soon as possible, whether it's part of the story or optional, that it doesn't just break the balance of the game. For example, if you could get double flight and glide right after clearing Olympus, then that would greatly diminish the platforming and progression of Corona's world. In KH3, you get glide thrown at you for Keyblade Graveyard, and it breaks all the puzzle movement there before the org fights. Secondly, you can also use it to mostly hard cheese some of the fights there as well. So going forward, it should be handled with more care when you get glide versus what challenges are left in the game. As yet another silly nitpick, I would like the way NPC Backseating is done to be handled differently. They obviously put it in the game to help players out that may not be paying enough attention, but they go way overboard. You get constantly dialogue spammed when moving throughout the worlds. From being told there's ingredients nearby to the simplest of instructions to progress in a world, it gets annoying and tiring real fast, especially with how bad many of the lines are delivered.
Oh, I guess I need to get through the door before it closes.
Try to break this ice.
Sora, why don't you try breaking this chunk of ice?
So these panels in the floor are switches for the doors.
There's something funny about that pillar.
Sora, try the pillar. And I think it opened when Sora rotated that pillar.
I'm hoping for KH4 that this gets reworked or toned down. There's plenty of other games that do this, but just not constantly, and especially not spamming the same exact lines. I might be looking at a certain duck on this one.
This might be a good spot to find some ingredients.
Back off!
So now, let me update my opinion on the Kupo Coin. Originally, when KH3 released, this coin felt a tad too busted. Remember, there was no critical mode. Purchasing this coin gives you a reserve auto life that fully restores your HP when you die. Of course, it is consumed after that and you would need to buy it again to reactivate the feature. This item is similar to some other games, like the equipable auto life accessories you can get across the various Soulsborne games, or in Devil May Cry, the yellow orbs. Of course, in regards to Soulsborne, you're expected to die frequently in that, and those items are fairly challenging to find. And for DMC, the cost of them goes up a good amount each time you try to buy one, and the currency for them is the same as many useful abilities that first-time players likely would not want to give up for one extra revive. So the thing about this is that on critical mode, it's likely players will die decently often enough where you just run out of money if you try to keep this active at all times, so for that difficulty, I don't necessarily care about it. But for Proud and lower, it definitely feels a tad too broken. When the game released without critical mode, this item felt like a joke to have active on Proud. If you're a seasoned KH player and played Proud blind on release, you'd probably have this bail you out later on in the game against a fight like Triple Nor and then make it seem easier than the fight actually should feel. If the item should persist in KH, I would like to see some rework there a tad, except perhaps beginner mode, where they can get all the freebies they want. Next up on the nitpick list, I have what feels like should actually be an important issue, which is the lack of checkpoints. This sounds weird because you would think that having too many checkpoints in areas would make the game too easy. But myself and others were annoyed at not being motivated to fight enemies in areas while exploring, because dying would reset your progress for that entire room. That wouldn't normally be too bad, except that KH3 areas can be gigantic, such as the toy store and Toy Story's world, which spans multiple floors. They really need to tweak this in the next game to be a tad more forgiving, since all it does is hinder the fun of exploring if dying undoes potentially 10 plus minutes of exploring and item finding. Lastly, I suppose it's worth mentioning that I'm not sure I really agree with getting second chance and once more super early just because you picked the shield. Those abilities are huge get out of jail free cards that I feel really should be more challenging to obtain. In KH1, only second chance existed, and it wasn't obtained until at earliest level 36, latest level 90. KH2 had second chance and once more, and earliest you can have both is level 49 with shield route. I'm not really convinced that KH3 was designed in a way that warrants having early access to these two abilities. So perhaps in KH4, we can maybe see a slight tweak to these for a better balance, because in KH3, the latest you get both abilities is by level 48 and the earliest is level 30, while if you pick the Guardian route, you would get once more, also known as Withstand Combo, at level 4, which is insanely early to get that. So that about wraps up my overall complaints. I could probably get nitpickier, but that's extreme small stuff you can look at in my older reviews of KH3. I believe most of them still stand. Regardless, as I pointed out earlier in this video, there is plenty that KH3 has done to modernize KH combat, because contrary to popular belief for me personally, I don't think KH3 would have been a good idea to just replicate KH2's combat, but with form changes over drive forms. Just like with what Final Fantasy does, there does need to be evolution to the combat design. KH doesn't need to be like Pokemon, where you only toss in like one new mechanic per game, but it plays almost identically otherwise. But seeing how KH was handled after KH2 with the handhelds, it was warranted to me to be alarmed that KH3 would replicate those missteps. Fortunately though, some fixes from that era were done and we got what feels like a fairly decent modernization of KH combat. It's important to never just be happy with remaining issues though, and to keep pushing for proper design to maximize the legacy of a game. I give the devs great props for coming up with proper challenging and fun super bosses in the DLC. But that won't stop me from telling them they botched base game balancing and other issues. I still keep speaking up about these problems in hopes it somehow reaches them for future KH games. And although we don't have an update on KH4 yet, that also means there's likely still time to get them to consider changes if any of the issues I mentioned still exist. At any rate, hope you all enjoyed the video, and we'll see how KH handles the next mainline. Thanks for watching.